Okay, welcome everyone. We have 3 fantastic talks for you this morning. I'm very excited about them. I hope you are too. Oh, the recording is starting now. So you're all very welcome. I was about to say make sure to keep your masks on throughout the talk, but I think that's just habit from the last few months of working with different groups. But to start us off this morning, and I hope you're as excited as I am, we have the wonderful Dr. Eamon Maher from TU Dublin. Eamon's talk today is on the echoes of Catholicism in Enright's The Gathering. So we're going to get Eamon's PowerPoint up here now, and I'll let him take over, and I hope you're all as excited as I am for it. All right, now Eamon, I'll just get a few there now. And there we go. I hope everyone can see that.
Thanks very much, Ian. It's great to be here. Sincere congratulations to Trish and her team on producing what is really a stellar lineup. Fantastic in these in these days of unprecedented heat. It's lovely to come into the study, which is the coldest room in the house for some reason, and that suits me at the moment anyway. So yeah, I apologies for changing the title, which is now the correct title is there anyway. Echoes of Catholicism in Anne Wright's The Gathering. You can go on to the next one there, Paul. Given how Catholicism has played such a central role in the history and evolution of Irish society, it is logical that it has featured strongly in our literature. Joyce, although fascinated with Catholic rituals and language, ended up replacing the religion of his youth with an unwavering commitment to art. In the 20th century, writers such as Canon Sheehan, Kate and Edna O'Brien, Liam O'Flaherty, John Broderick, Brian Moore, and John McGahern depicted a world in which Catholicism played a central role. But they never quite succeeded in producing what I would describe as a Catholic novel, along the lines of the works of François Mauriac and Georges Bernanos in France, or of Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene in England. I would argue that the closest we came to achieving this was with Kate O'Brien's The Anteroom, published in 1934, which really comes to grips with the dilemma of staying true to one's faith when confronted with a passion that, if consummated, would result in sin and possible damnation. The psychological probing of the devout Agnes Mulqueen's attraction to her sister's husband, Vincent de Courcy O'Regan, which comes to a crisis point when the family gather to celebrate a triduum of masses for their dying mother, places Catholicism as at the heart of the plot, and hence the Anteroom could possibly be deemed a Catholic novel. However, it is a once-off, and so doesn't actually constitute ample evidence that the genre ever really took a root in Ireland. Augustine Martin spoke of the inherited descent of many Irish novelists, which placed them automatically on a collision course with a powerful church institution. Writers tend to be countercultural, and hence it is reasonable to contend that Irish writers may well have been a lot more Catholic if the country had been less so. Thanks. Next one, Paul, please. The steady secularization of Ireland in the latter decades of the 20th century and the opening decades of the 21st was accelerated by the clerical abuse scandals and the resultant sharp decline in the moral authority of priests and religious. Ironically, the emergence of what is termed a post-Catholic society could well result in Catholicism featuring more in Irish fiction, albeit in a very different guise. After all, post-Catholic does not indicate in any way that Catholicism has disappeared, far from it, but rather that people view it in a different manner and feel less constrained by its teachings. The cultural references to Catholicism the residual belief system, do not automatically go when faith declines. Not many people would suspect one of Ireland's foremost contemporary fiction writers, Anne Enright, of being overly concerned with Catholicism. She is of a different generation to Heaney, McGahern, and the irrepressible Edna O'Brien, all of whom lived in an Ireland that was dominated by a religiosity that extended to every facet of people's lives. When Enright's novel, The Gathering, was published in 2007 and won the prestigious Man Booker Prize, it was noticeable that at a time when the Celtic tiger was still roaring and the forces of secularism were taking a firm hold, there was so much Catholic content in the book. The Athlone novelist John Broderick explained in an interview with RTE broadcaster David Hanley shortly before his death in 1989 the permanent hold that his Catholic upbringing exerted on him. And he quoted, and this is the quote, anyone who is reared in a Catholic atmosphere, first of all, takes in that Catholic atmosphere more or less through their pores. That phrase has always resonated with me. Even though people may stray from the teachings of the Church and decide to ignore many of the religious tenets imparted to them at home and in school, Catholicism remains in the pores, ready to resurface at any moment. Next one, please, Paul. I am not suggesting that Anne Enright somehow rediscovered Catholicism when she was writing The Gathering, but rather that the novel could only have been written by someone with an intimate understanding of how Catholicism operates in Ireland. The narrative reveals the extent to which tragic events, suicide in this case, can revive past traumas and reveal secrets that may have lain dormant for many years. The narrator is a 39-year-old woman, Veronica, née Hegarty, who was brought up in a family of 12 children and was closest to her alcoholic sibling, Liam, who, with discovering the opening pages, was fished from the sea at Brighton after deciding that his life was no longer worth living. The gathering of the title refers to the wake the family organises for Liam in Dublin, which is the trigger for a discussion of what might have been the source of their dead brother's problems. Veronica knows they date back to the abuse inflicted on him by Lam Nugent, a sinister character who controlled their grandmother Ada after the death of her husband and his friend Charlie, a hapless, inept man who left his family in penury. Nugent seized on the opportunity to gain ownership of the family home, where he was a regular visitor and a malevolent presence. As a young girl, Veronica entered the good room in Ada's house one day, where she found her brother and Nugent engaged in a disturbing sexual act. Nugent looked up and saw her at the door, but did not betray any sign of panic at being disturbed. He merely told her to leave, knowing that she could never speak to anyone of what she had seen. After Liam's death, she relives the episode in her mind and remarks, "It is the struggle in Lam Nugent's face that is unbearable, between the man who does not approve of this pleasure and the one who is weak to it." She also remembers the terrified look on her brother's face, and she feels guilty that she did nothing to save him. At a time when there is far more public awareness of paedophilia and sexual abuse generally, the notion that a man could so blatantly engage in illegal and lewd acts with a minor and get away with it seems unconscionable. Yet, up until relatively recently in Ireland, such issues were rarely discussed or even thought possible. Veronica realises that Liam's fate was sealed by what he suffered at the hands of Nugent, but equally she knows that the social reality at that time was very different. And I'm quoting from the novel, "Of course, no one knew how these things worked at the time. We looked at the likes of Liam and had a whole different story for it, a different set of words. Pup, gurrier, monkey, thug, hopeless, useless, mad, messer. You can go to the next one, Paul, please. No one thought to ask why Liam behaved in the manner he did. In later life, Veronica is struck by the contrast between the public and private Nugent. Ostensibly a devoted husband and father, he was nevertheless having an affair with Ada and abusing her grandson. He was at the pro-cathedral that morning for early mass. He walked in a line with other men for Holy Communion. The look on their faces was as hungry as poor men queuing for soup. And when he got up from his knees, he did so like a decent man. Slow in the haunches, heavy with the weight of his life on this earth, sad for the people he loved, brave. The reality could not have been more different, however, as is clear from his actions. But Nugent is not the only one leading a double life. Veronica thinks of how her own parents also engaged in a devout and unthinking observance of their Catholic duties. And this is the quote at the end there. Of course, Mammy is a Catholic, in the way that Mammies are. But for 14 years or so, I sat by or behind my father on a wooden church bench every Sunday morning. And in all that time, I never saw his lips move. I never heard him pray aloud, or even saw him bend his head, or do anything that might be considered remarkable were he sitting on the top deck of a bus. Veronica's parents are representative of swathes of Irish couples from a few decades ago, would never dream of missing Mass, but who often had nothing other than a superficial grasp of their faith. Religion was habitual for them, just as it became normal for Veronica to cease attending Mass once she left home. She describes how her daughter Rebecca is going through what she describes as a pious phase, which she suspects may well be an effort to annoy her mother. Veronica has a brother, Ernest, who was ordained a priest, but has long since left the fold, although nobody tells their mother what has happened. Indeed, she asked to be blessed by him on his return from South America for Liam's funeral, a task he is quite willing to perform. Next slide, please, Paul. Excuse me. Enright's real skill as a novelist can be seen in her ability to get inside the head of her main protagonist, Veronica, who, in spite of having an attractive and attentive husband and two lovely daughters, a comfortable home and good standard of living, is nevertheless dissatisfied with her life. In addition, she has a somewhat conflicted attitude to sex, which may be the result of her having also been abused as a child by Nugent, and then occluding the traumatic memory of what happened from her mind. Whatever the reason, she is damaged and fragile. When all the Hegartys assemble to say farewell to their brother Liam, Veronica once more entertains morose thoughts. Now I know that look in Liam's eye was the look of someone who knows they are alone, because the world will never know what has happened to you and what you carry around as a result of it. Even your sister, your saviour in a way, the girl who stands in the light of the hall, even she does not hold or remember the thing she saw, because by that stage, I think I had forgotten it entirely. It was only when the revelations began to appear in the Irish media about what had happened in industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, or the findings of the various reports on clerical sex abuse, that Veronica came to see that others had suffered a similar fate to Liam. Nevertheless, looking at her brother's corpse and reflecting on what she knew of his life, she cannot help feeling responsible for what happened to him. Some hope for the family is provided by the discovery that Liam and his former girlfriend, Sarah, had a son, Rowan, whose close resemblance to his father makes them think that their brother will live on in this fresh new life. And although the slow procession to Liam's grave is painful, Veronica says that, quote, being part of a family is the most excruciating way to be alive. There is still the chance that some good can emerge from this tragedy. There is no reconciliation with Catholicism for Veronica, but the waking of the corpse in their mother's house, shaking hands with those who come to pay their respects, the funeral mass and burial, all combine to bring finality and dignity to the life of her brother. Rowan is almost like a gift from God. They lose one person only to have him replaced by another. The Irish do funerals extremely well, and this is imputable to the skill and compassion of priests, the beauty of the ceremony, and the way in which communities come together to console the bereaved and celebrate the life that has just ended. Last slide, Paul, please. Anne Enright's award-winning novel is therefore more than just a great literary achievement. It also shows that Catholicism continues to play an important role for many Irish people at various points in their lives. Veronica, in particular, is in need of healing because of what she witnessed all those years previously. As she says in the last lines of the novel, I've been falling into my own life for months, and I am about to hit it now. It is at this crucial point that religion has the capacity to be a vital source of consolation, and that literature fulfills one of its invaluable attributes, to reflect lived experience in an authentic and mimetic manner. The Gathering may not qualify to be described as a Catholic novel, but it could only have been written by someone who, like Enright, possesses a Catholic sensibility. Other examples in Irish fiction will undoubtedly follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eamon. Hopefully we should be back there now. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much, Eamon. I hope I imagine loads of people will have questions for you, and we will take those at the end. But if you want to start putting them in the chat now, feel free and we'll get back to them. So our next wonderful talk today is by Dr. John McDonagh and Dr. Patricia Kieran, whom some of you may know. Somehow their research has brought them together. I'm not exactly sure how. I have to think about that one. And I think, unfortunately, I must check. I still have the old title for the paper.
Oh God, I'm trying
to. I know. Oh wait, I believe is the updated version. Everything was answerable. Catholicism and education in Brendan Kennelly's Catechism.
That is the correct title.
And I do apologize to Eamon for reading the older title at the beginning. So for John and Trish, whenever you're ready.
I'm trying to upload now. That's it. Is this it?
Yeah, sure.
No problem, just take your time.
Are you seeing anything there?
Yeah, we can see the PowerPoint now.
Okay. I just want to. Okay. So, can you see the PowerPoint? I don't know what you can see.
So we can see the full screen at the moment, Trish, with space for notes around.
Oh, you can see everything. Can you see now just one? Can you see just one slide now?
I can still see everything at the moment. I think
Can you see us?
We don't want you to see us.
We can see you. I can just see the full PowerPoint screen with notes at the side still.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know why.
Get rid of the notes.
Take your time.
I'm just trying to enlarge that so that
we'll do it that way.
Is that? Can you just see one slide? If not, we'll just continue as is. And
I can still see all the slides at the moment.
I
but-
am so sorry, but we'll go with that. We'll go with that. Apologies. Is one slide highlighted more than others?
Yeah. I can
Okay.
see one slide big.
Okay. So our presentation is Everything Was Answerable: Catholicism and Education in Brendan Kennelly's Catechism.
And can I just say what an honour it is to follow two titans of contemporary Irish critical theory, Mark Patrick Hederman and Eamon Maher. It's a privilege to follow those two. So what myself and Patricia are going to talk about today, and Paul, our research came together. You kind of asked a good question out of two subjects which really have overlapped for decades in Ireland, which is obviously studies of the Catholic influence in Ireland and literature, because it's very hard to find a writer. Eamon highlighted and Enright, it's very hard to find an Irish writer who has avoided Catholicism over the past century. And Brendan Kennelly's work, I was really struck by what Mark Patrick Hederman talked about, the carriages behind the locomotive. Brendan's work really is about an attempt, I think, to highlight some of the more negative aspects of people's experiences of catechism and of the manifestation of Catholic studies in primary schools. Brendan, as you know, author of over 50 books, 30 plus collections of poetry, 2 novels, 4 plays, a critic, a teacher, Professor Emeritus in TCD. Brendan is now in a nursing home down in County Kerry, in Listowel, County Kerry, and is not, I don't think, in the best of health. So if Brendan or anybody sees this, we just wish him the best. Now, the poems we're going to talk about today come from the collection called The Boats Are Home, which was first published in 1980 by Peter Fallon's Gallery Press. And The Boats Are Home is largely an autobiographical collection, and Brendan deals really with his experience of growing up in Ballylongford in North Kerry. And it's a quartet of sonnets called, 4 of them are To Learn, Catechism, The Stick, and After School. And the 4 really have to be read together. But the poem we're going to concentrate on today is Catechism. And it's quite interesting that I've given many talks on Kennelly over the years at various places in various countries. And this poem, Catechism, once it's read, really strikes a chord with certain Irish people of a certain age who went through the Irish primary school system in the 1940s and 50s. It's a poem that seems to resonate with a lot of people.
So what is catechism? And I love catechisms. Catechism comes from the Greek word katechismos, and it means word of mouth, with all the rich connotations of an oral tradition. And sometimes we associate catechisms with small question and answer books designed for children, but catechisms are infinitely more ancient and complex and varied than that. And if we look at the Gospels are catechisms, because catechisms are designed to communicate faith and to give an account of faith that's accessible, that's memorizable, that's authoritative, and that engages with the people who are receiving it. So the Gospel of Luke was written to Theophilus so that you may know the truth. It's concerned with truth concerning the things which you have been catechized. So catechisms are concerned with truth and teaching. And we have wonderful catechisms, the Catechism of the Didache in the 2nd century, the way of light and darkness, good and evil. And again, beautiful catechism coming from St. Augustine, which has really influenced us throughout the history of Christianity. And Augustine writes to Deo Gratias, and Deo Gratias is a teacher, and he says sometimes when he's teaching his students who are not particularly learned, that he's bored even by his own teaching. So he writes to Augustine and says, tell me what to do. And Augustine wrote a fantastic catechism in the 5th century. But Augustine's advice was, note that students have different levels of learning and adjust your teaching to the students' levels. And teaching and learning shouldn't be tedious or boring. And I think we forget that. I forget that as a teacher. And Augustine had such classical wisdom. Focus on stories, he says, and make a story out of the Christian tradition, from creation to redemption and salvation, and focus on the final things. So that's how his catechism is arranged. And all the time, like Mark Patrick said, foreground God's love. And be cheerful to the students and they will mirror you. So in Ireland, if we look at the catechism. Now we're moving on many centuries, a millennium and a half, to come to Ireland from Augustine to the 18th and 19th century. And at the time of the Reformation, the Catechism of the Council of Trent in 1545, the Catechism came after that, 1566, and the Catechism outlined Orthodox Catholic teaching. And of course, we have Luther's Catechism, Calvin's Catechism, Zwingli's Catechism, we have Heidelberg Catechism. So it's not just a Catholic device for teaching and learning. But at the time of the Reformation, the Catechism was the authoritative teaching, and it was designed for adults and for clergy, and it was used in seminaries. If we go into the 19th century, the Catechism moved into parishes, and it moved into the homes of people, and it moved into schools. And so in the 19th century in Ireland, we have the Catechism, the Penny Catechism, Bishop Chandler's Penny Catechism. This is the kind of learning in religious instruction that people got right up to the 1960s. And Brendan Kennelly's catechism is one of the catechisms that would have been taught in dioceses. They were adapted for dioceses. So here's his poem.
So Tricia's given you a succinct idea of the theory, but here's the practice of how it manifested itself in the classroom. Catechism. Religion class. Mulcahy taught us God while he heated his arse to a winter fire, testing with his fingers the supple sally rod. Explain the Immaculate Conception, Maguire, and tell us then about the mystical blood. Maguire failed. Mulcahy covered the boy's head with his satchel, shoved him stumbling among the desks, lashed his bare legs until they bled. Who goes to hell, Deneen? Cain, what's a saint? Doolan, what constitutes a mortal sin? Flynn, what of the man who calls his brother a fool? Years killed raving questions. Cain stomped around Dublin in policemen's boots. Flynn was afraid of himself. Maguire did well out of whores in Liverpool. Now, the poem for me it's a sonnet, as you can see, a classic Shakespearean sonnet. Brendan was fascinated by the sonnet form throughout the 1980s and 90s. His collection, Cromwell, his collection, The Book of Judas, which explores the role of Judas in the Irish religious psyche. The sonnet is a wonderful form, because what the sonnet is, it's a pseudo-logical poem in which you can deal with one central idea and tease out the many manifestations of this one idea. And I love this idea of Mulcahy taught us God. And the fundamental argument in this poem, I think the fundamental image for me is the mystical blood, is that he presents the teacher as punishing the boy for not knowing what the mystical blood is by shedding the boy's blood. So for the teacher, the catechism was a theory, an idea, this notion of a mystical blood. What is it? And everything was explainable. Everything had a question and an answer. And he says, years killed raving questions. And for those of you who know Brendan Kennelly and his attitude towards education, this is the polar opposite of the education that Brendan Kennelly would have experienced himself in Trinity as a lecturer. The next slide, please. Thanks. And what happens in the poem, again, is that this reductionism of very complex religious and philosophical concepts reduced to game show-like questions and answers. To ask children of 7, 8, 9, and 10, what is the mystical blood? Who goes to hell? What of the man who calls his brother a fool? And of course, the great irony in the poem is the teacher is calling all of his pupils fools because they don't know the answers to these questions. And the key one is, I think, this mystical blood, this image of whether a child can even understand what these very fundamental, deep theological concepts are, which theologians have struggled with for centuries. And yet the catechism reduces it merely to 2 and 2 equals 4. And Maguire's fate, I think the three fates of the three central characters that are mentioned are very, very interesting. You've Cain, Flynn, and Maguire. And for Cain, of course, Cain internalizes, rationalizes, and repeats the behavior. He becomes a policeman. And this idea of the internalization of violence. For Flynn, he becomes afraid of himself. The consequences of the violence were totally destructive. And I won't mention names, but I did give a talk on this in Limerick about 10 years ago. And I remember this man came up to me afterwards and he reminded me of Flynn. And he spoke to me of his experiences of catechism in the primary classroom in the 1950s in Limerick. And he looked to me like a man who was afraid of himself. He was still traumatized 40 years afterwards in terms of the violence meted out by that particular system. And of course, Maguire is the one who does well out of horse in Liverpool. Maguire rejects this system that has been forced upon him. He throws up two fingers to it, emigrates from Ireland and goes to Liverpool and makes a living in a manner you imagine which is the complete opposite to what that catechism is attempting to inculcate into the students. And Brian Moore, who Liam knows very well, Liam Kieran, Brian had this wonderful quote, I think, when he talks about his reaction to it. He said, "We were caned for every single mistake we made. In a day, I would receive the cane anything up to 10 or 12 times. We were caned on the hand for every mistake. You were caned for everything. So when you did your homework at night, you knew that if you didn't get it right, in the morning you were going to be caned. You were caned for any infraction of the rules whatsoever." So what Brendan Kennelly is describing is a relatively common experience in the 50s. Now, for a lot of the people attending this conference, probably too young to remember corporal punishment in schools. But for a lot of older people, it was a very common experience. And Tom O'Donoghue has this wonderful quote that I think Brendan is hinting at, is that Catholicism introduced me to the notion that everything was answerable. And when you look at Mark Patrick's wonderful talk this morning about the unanswerability of so many questions in life, Brendan has pointed to the fact that this was a system that had answers for everything.
I think one of the key wonderful parts of the poem as well is the parallel with Christ. The children are identified with Christ because as their legs are lashed, you're reminded of the scourging of the pillar. And as the satchel is put over the children's head and they're stumbling, they are paralleling the crowning of thorns, Jesus's crowning of thorns. And I think Kennelly has identified the children with Christ. Now, as a teaching methodology, the catechism was very popular, and it must have been wonderful because you had a handbook with about 300 questions and all the answers. The teachers knew all the answers. And of course, we're a million miles away from St. Augustine. In the hands of a gifted teacher and catechist, the catechism could come alive. And I don't think Kennelly is suggesting that everybody was brutalizing children, but through this fictional lens, he's making this moment in time, a brutal catechism class, come alive for us and to see the irony and the hypocrisy. So for teachers loved it because they had a question and answer there. You knew immediately if you had achieved learning in that the children would be able to repeat the question and give the correct answer. And so it was very, very popular. However, John Coulihan, who sadly died 2 years ago and was Professor of Education in Maynooth and a legendary Irish educator, I interviewed him a number of years ago, and he said there was a time pre-Vatican II when religious instruction for him was the darkest subject on the school curriculum. And he spoke about the excess of information and the paucity of formation. And as an example of that, my own mother recounted as a child learning all of these things. And the catechisms were mnemonic devices. They were like memory wraps, and they enabled children to upload doctrine, Christian doctrine, onto the hard drive of their brain so that they could download it later on in life when they were adults. And it did work for some, but for many it didn't. And for instance, my 7-year-old mother had to learn that there were 7 deadly sins, namely pride, covetousness, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. And of course, to a 7-year-old, those words mean nothing. But my mother was totally confused because she thought there were 8 deadly sins. Because in her mind, namely, there are 7 deadly sins, namely, pride, covetousness, for her, namely, was as deadly as any of the others. And I suppose one of the ironies as well of the catechism is that for junior infants, for 4- and 5-year-olds, the most profound philosophical questions were the easiest questions to answer. Question 3 in the catechism for the infants at 4 was, what is God? God is the supreme spirit. So,
guys, unfortunately, I just saw a thing. I don't know where our slide's moving. So if that didn't happen, apologies for that.
Sorry, we didn't see them, unfortunately, John and Trish.
oh, you should have told
interesting.
I'm so sorry.
Apologies for that, guys. We thought it was moving on our side.
I'm so sorry. But anyway, so I suppose we just want to end by talking about the fact that, you know, I suppose literature holds up a mirror, a fictional mirror or a lens to look at, I suppose, a certain type of religious instruction in Ireland. And Kennelly is particularly good at that.
And I think it also has to be pointed out that literature has shone quite a negative light on the experience of Catholicism, particularly in education. And when you look at Eamon's work on John McGahern, for example, you see this continually difficult presentation of the interaction between the Catholic Church and the primary school education system.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to that, John and Trish, and I'm very sorry about the technical issues. I thought it was just my laptop for the first few minutes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
But I think, don't worry, we were all enthralled just by your voices anyway, and I think you made pictures with words.
Thank you.
I think we have lots of chat going on in the chat about your talk, and I think we'll have a great conversation about it afterwards. But first, last but not least, we have one more fantastic talk to go. So next up, we have Camilo Villanueva from Murray State, who's coming to us all the way from Japan. And Camilo's talk is The Lord's Voice, Catholicism in Tolkien's translation of Sir Orfeo. And we're very excited to hear this. We're very excited to have you, Camilo. And I hope you all enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me perfectly? Do you want to try maybe move your slides just to make sure we're all...
Yeah, do you see just the first slide?
Yeah.
Do you see the second?
Yeah, looking good.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for watching my presentation. I'm a student, I'm a Filipino-American student at Murray State, and I'm also an EFL teacher here in Japan. And I'd like to say thank you for allowing me to present some findings about Tolkien's translation of Sir Orfeo, which is an 800-year-old Middle English Breton lay. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. This research came from a Middle English language and literature class that I had. I kind of stumbled upon Tolkien. I'm not so familiar with his work, but I was in the process of trying to understand Sir Orfeo, and I couldn't find a very good translation of it. I found one translation from 1914, and then I discovered that Tolkien had written one. He actually translated Sir Orfeo, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and Pearl. So in going through the kind of explication of the poem, I was kind of wondering why there was some word choice changes, which brings me here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tolkien's life as a Catholic, and I want to maybe show why he's interested in Sir Orfeo, and I want to go through, so it's mostly textual analysis of Sir Orfeo. I did a line-by-line textual analysis, 605 lines of Sir Orfeo, of the Olchinleck manuscript, which is kind of like my base that I used. I also looked at another manuscript that Tolkien used to write his own Middle English translation of Sir Orfeo, and along with his English translation of Sir Orfeo. It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully it will be clearer later. Yeah, and these are some questions. What does the textual analysis reveal? Is there evidence of his faith, Tolkien's faith, in his word choice? So next slide. Yeah, as I mentioned, I stumbled upon Sir Orfeo last year. I found his translation and Tolkien's translation. I don't really need to introduce Tolkien because everyone knows who he is. But what I didn't know about him, being an American, I didn't know that he was Catholic and he was very devout, and he had a really difficult childhood when he was 12 years old in 1904. I think his mother, they all caught pneumonia, and his mother died. He was 12 years old, and his brother nearly died, and both boys became wards of a Catholic priest. And of course, he was an Oxford professor, and let's see. That's all I want to say about that. So Sir Orfeo, I think maybe, I don't know how many of you know about it. Maybe you guys know already. But it was an anonymous late 13th to 14th century Breton lay, likely a translation from Marie de France's now non-extant poem, Les d'Orfèvre. So quickly, Sir Orfeo tells a story of a king who loses his wife to fairies, and the wife is taken underground, literally into a rock, into fairyland. Sir Orfeo, as the king, he gives up his kingdom and roams the wilderness for 10 years, searching for her. And he also has a great skill. Orfeo can play the harp, and he's so amazing at the harp that he even attracts animals when he plays. So Orfeo is finally able to gain entrance to the kingdom, and he's able to use his music and his trickery to rescue his wife. And he brings her back to the kingdom. This is based on the Orpheus myth. So what was the attraction for Tolkien? I believe that the language, Tolkien being a scholar, that was amazing. The imagery, also the heroic rescue of the lady Herodes. She could be seen as like Tolkien's mother figure, or perhaps Mary. So this is the Apostles' Creed, and the reason I'm showing you this is it's 23 lines. And what's interesting about Sir Orfeo is I did some analysis of Sir Orfeo, and I'll show you here. This is from another study, and I'm sorry, it's very small, but I divided the poem into 22 sections based on line indents. And what I noticed is through textual study that 7 or around 30% of these sections, I don't want to call them stanzas, but these sections were around 20 to 24 lines. So, when you think about that and see the depiction of the Apostles' Creed, and then also realizing that these sections of the lay are around the same length, it's interesting to me. I don't know about you. About the manuscripts that I used. So this is the base. I told you this is online. I hope it's okay, I put a QR code. If you have a smart device, you can look at it. This is available online. This is Lascaya and Salisbury's. They have some not translations, but they have that Sir Orfeo was in many different pieces. So they put it together and mainly use the Auchinleck manuscript as the base. So this is what I used. There's a gloss in it, and I used that. I also looked at CSAM's edition. Sorry, I put an X there. CSAM's edition, like I said, I did a line-by-line analysis and compared CSAM's edition of the poem. There's many editions, and there weren't many differences that I found. So I'm not going to look at that today. Tolkien had mentioned that he used CSAM's edition to write his own Middle English translation. I don't want to talk about Tolkien's translation either so much because there's not much difference, I think, between that and the Auchinleck manuscript. So what's interesting to me is Tolkien's English translation. And I also used the University of Michigan Middle English Compendium. to supplement the gloss supplied in Laskaya and Salisbury's text. And you don't have to read this, but I just want you to kind of see some of my data and the big picture. So there's, out of all these, I think it's around 5%. This is only 5% of the lines of Sir Orfeo where there's actual textual differences. So with Tolkien's English translation. So looking at the Ultralic manuscript with the gloss, and also looking at definitions with the Middle English compendium from the University of Michigan, Tolkien's 95% is almost the same. But so what brings me here today is the 5%. It was just really glaring, like why would Tolkien decide to choose a different word, or maybe add words, or maybe kind of create a different image just for some of these. So let's see. These are some examples. This is not a very strong example of influences from his faith, but on the left side you see the line number. The second column is the Ultralic manuscript, which is mainly the Salisbury Laskaya text that I use as my base. The third column is the gloss definition, along with, in parentheses, the Middle English compendium supplement. So the gloss didn't include a perfect translation of the Middle English. And then on the right side is Tolkien's English translation. So this is just an example at the very beginning of the poem. Like, for example, for Soth, line 12, that would be relate, but Tolkien chose sing. And the same thing in line 24. For tell, Sky Salisbury didn't have a gloss for that, but according to Middle English compendium, it's defined as speak. Tolkien also said sing for that. So, you know, why would he change that? This is kind of like a meta technique, maybe. Tolkien was, he knew that these lays were not written, they were maybe sung. So he wanted to use sing, but there could also be maybe some influence from his faith with song. This is maybe a better example of an addition, a deviation, more significant on line 160. What you're seeing on the slide is, sorry, it's a Kindle edition of Tolkien's English translation of Sir Orfeo. And the word wild is nowhere to be found in the original Middle English manuscript. And I also looked at CSAM's Middle English translation to see, you know, was it different from that? Because Tolkien based his Middle English translation off of that. Yeah, the word wild is not there. The actual Middle English was, sorry, pardon my terrible pronunciation, rivers, forests, frith with floors. So rivers, forests, and then maybe woods with flowers, or forested with flowers. So Tolkien added the image of the animal. And so I wonder if his faith could have had any influence on that. And this is a something I pulled from the internet of St. Anthony with animals. Other examples, in line 435, I'm calling this kind of a substitution, not an addition, where the last one saw an addition. So the word ground, Tolkien chose to use the word ground instead of down. So the original text is translated as before the king sat down. And then the next line, you see, if Tolkien was thinking about rhyme, down rhymes with sound. So why would he change it to ground? I don't think we'll ever know. But what that brought to mind is, you can see this is the Middle English there. Before the king, he sat adon and took his heart so midi of son. It sounds nice. Sorry, not with my pronunciation. You know, so I'm wondering why would he change that to ground? And it could be perhaps alluding to famous scene in John 8 where Jesus writes on the ground. And what's interesting is this part of the lay is when Sir Orfeo is confronting the fairy king, and his wife is held prisoner there. So I don't know if and it was a similar situation, I think, in John 8, but and these are some other images, you can have a look here. It doesn't match up perfectly, the lines on the left side. 42 of Auchinleck manuscript is actually 28 of Tolkien's Middle English. But like just other examples, like large, which is translated as generous. In Tolkien's English, he creates gifts of a king. So Tolkien's line is a courteous king whose gifts were good. Whereas if you translate it, it's generous and courteous he was also. And then body and bones means flesh and bone, or it also means the whole body, where Tolkien says flesh and blood. These aren't, these are very subtle changes, but to me, they could mean something. And also, these are some final examples here. I don't have a lot of time to go through these, time's running up, but Tolkien talks about how the world goes. He writes how the world goes in his Middle English, but in his English translation, he writes how it all must end. And then the next line is Sir Orfeo is confronting his steward and saying that he tested his honor, and the steward passed, but if he didn't pass, Orfeo said, you'd be banished immediately. But in Tolkien's translation, he said, you'll have to be thrust from the gate. So these kinds of images I thought could be significant. Just some concluding remarks. There are many limitations in my study. I'm not a literary scholar. I'm a fiction writer, and also I'm a student of English pedagogy. So I think my analysis is maybe superficial. It's also subjective. I'm seeing what I want to see. And I think there needs to be more investigation into this, more textual analysis to know what Tolkien really wrote, because these, Sir Orfeo was not touched. There's great evidence that Sir Orfeo was not touched from 1940s until his death, when it was published posthumously. So I think Tolkien just put it to the side and focused on The Lord of the Rings. Something interesting was Tolkien's contribution from McCullough's book on the history of Christianity. Is he says that The Lord of the Rings is an English Catholic parallel to the Book of Mormon's type of frontier fiction. So McCullough is quoting Brodie. At the end of Sir Orfeo, there's one omission, and I'll get to that real fast. God grant us all well to fare, amen. So this is actually one of the few examples where Tolkien follows Sisam's Middle English version with his own, where Sisam's doesn't have amen, but in the Auchinleck it has it. So I wonder, why he didn't want to include it, but I think maybe Tolkien wasn't finished with his work. But yeah, these are, so I have lots of works cited in case you're interested, page 1, page 2. And these are my contact details. So thank you very much for letting me talk to you today. And it's a great honor again.
Thank you very much, Camilo. That was very interesting.
Let me stop sharing.
Take your time. So three fantastic papers there. I think everybody will agree. And some very interesting kind of overlaps and differences, and some very interesting close readings in general. So I have a few questions for the panel, but I might open it up to our chat first if anyone wants to kick us off. If anyone would like to either put a message in the chat box and I can ask the group, or if you want to ask it yourself, feel free to turn your microphone on.
Paul, can I jump in there? It's John.
Yeah, John, go for it.
I just want to respond to my sister Anne, actually, who's tuning in from the south of France. I just want to tell her I think it's hotter here than it is in the south of France today, possibly. But she did also ask, were there any positive portrayals of Catholicism in Irish literature? And Micheál replied to the chat. He mentioned a first confession, and I just threw in there that Father Ted now almost appears as a nostalgic, positive view of Catholicism. I know it's obviously fictional, but you know, you would struggle to find positive portrayals. One I could think of was Paul Durkin had a Jesuit priest in Gonzaga in the 1960s who had a very positive effect. His name escapes me now off the top of my head, who had a very positive effect upon him in terms of encouraging him to write his poetry. So there are positive examples, but it would have to be said that the negative far outweighs the positive in terms of you know, portrayals of Catholicism in literature. It tends to outweigh the positive.
It's very interesting. Actually, John, I might ask yourself and Eamon maybe a question in relation to that, and let people think if they want to ask any more. As we're kind of talking about all of these, I suppose, negative portrayals of Catholicism, but could some of these portrayals be considered a hope at reforming the church? Or do you think it's all very much aiming towards kind of getting rid of it altogether?
Well, if I could respond, I don't think poets or novelists see a role for themselves in reforming anything. I think they're more interested in producing good art, and where the art comes in is making that lived experience into something sometimes transcendent, sometimes the very opposite. It descends into despair. So, you know, novelists in particular can fall into the trap of didacticism, and they must always try and ensure that what they're putting forward is an objective view of reality. And in response to John's about the positive portrayals of Catholicism, I think Kate O'Brien's The Land of Spices is an extremely positive portrayal of what the nuns in Laurel Hill imparted to the young girls under their care, where they inspired them to be ambitious, to seek out a path in life other than necessarily contenting themselves with marriage and making a home. So that was, for its time, was very insightful. And there was also within Kate O'Brien a lot of the, when she describes rituals, she does so in a very, very empathetic manner, that she talks about the silence descending on groups during Mass, and that they were aware of the fact that they're in the presence of God, and she gets that across very, very well.
Sorry, John, you're muted there at the moment, I think.
That's the great thing about technology. You can mute me when you want, or I can mute myself. But just to briefly say that I think before you have a reformation, you have to have a long, honest, kind of Joycean look in the mirror, and to see what it is you want to reform. And I think the role of poems like Catechism is to prepare the ground for a reformation. Eamon is right that you don't want to be politically didactic. However, poems like Catechism, I think the treatment of the Annals of the Catholic Church by John McGahern, for example, this prepares the ground for a reformation. It tries to strip away the veneer to show us what exactly it is needs reforming, and then maybe it's up to someone else to do that reformation. But writers, I think, play a crucial role in shining a light on kind of unwelcome areas.
Thank you very much, John and Eamon. Liam, did you have a question? Do you want to ask it
Yes,
there?
well, just I know it's sort of an overlapping one between Eamon, Tish, and John. And I flagged up, I didn't mean to put it in such large text, my own book, my own doctorate from 20 years ago on the landscapes of encounter, the portrayal of Catholicism in the novels of Brian Moore. And although in his lifetime he thought it was a bit of an albatross around his neck to be the favourite living author of Graham Greene, Brian Moore's Catholics, I think, is actually a supremely overlooked volume. I think it's one of the really best, aside from the Catholic themes, best novellas there is, literally in the 20th century. And if you go back to that work in the 1970s, Brian Moore, Belfast born, and everything, very antagonistic in his early novels to Catholicism. And my work looks at the pre and post Vatican II. I mean, that if you look at that short 100-page novella,